Hello everyone, now we're back with a new video with Amos Zweig. Last time we talked we discussed human nature and problems with, for instance, socialist or Marxist ideologies and their false views on human nature and how we need to take human nature and needs and talents and preferences into account when we organize society. So now we're going to talk more about what kind of society we should have, which would reflect true human nature and needs and privileges and rights of human beings, which is a very interesting and very important topic, and I would say have always been a very important topic. It's an eternal or timeless topic, we might say. Amos, we have this idea that we human beings, we have a certain nature. We have certain needs and preferences and talents and a certain tendency to do certain things. And when we organize a society, what do you think we should start with when it comes to human nature to determine the basis of that society?
That is a very good question and a very difficult one. And yes, I'm also really looking forward to this discussion because I think, just as you said, that human nature and the way we organize society out of our own view of what human nature is probably the most essential question for like political philosophy. So I don't think that I can like give an all-encompassing account of human nature, of course, here at the start, but there are certain characteristics that go through my mind. So one thing is, which you already mentioned in the first comment that you put under my video, is human beings are social animals. They live in groups. And this, I think, is an essential point. But at the same time, it is complicated because human beings are not like ants or like bees, where there is only one fertile queen and all the other members of the tribe are just like sterile workers, but human beings each are capable of reproducing. And so there is not only cooperation between human beings, but there is also competition at the same time. So a human society must certainly allow both of these somehow conflicting, or both of these conflicting desires to have room. So the society must in some way be organized such that people can cooperate, and to a certain extent also that cooperation is what's the right word? Is supported, that it is encouraged. But at the same time, it must also leave room for people to compete and to try to gain social status, try to gain property for themselves, to improve their own individual circumstances, and also through that to become attractive, to find a mate and to have a family of their own where society doesn't intervene too much. So I think that's a start.
Yes, that's a very, very interesting and well-argued point, that we human beings, we are social animals by nature, as Aristotle and others have argued. And this is why, of course, the liberal view of human nature, that we are somehow by nature just separated autonomous individuals that have nothing to do with other people. And then we construct a society based on artificial consent. That's a false view, because we create societies because it is within our human nature to be social. So that's very important, that society is natural to us. It's natural to human beings. And every collection of humans will interact in some fundamental social ways. But also, as you say, that doesn't mean that we'll have a society where everyone is completely, you could say, identical to what they do, or that they wouldn't have any competition between them, that there wouldn't be distinctions and boundaries. There would be several sets of social interactions and social communities within the large human family, you could say. And as you mentioned, human beings not only are social, but they also by nature reproduce. They find other human beings and they have children with them. And thus we could say that it is natural for human beings to have families, to form families with some mate of the other sex, and then have children, and then they take care of that children. So there is this very intimate human community of the family. And every society that reflects human nature needs to have a family with a set of liberties and privileges that is different from just people interacting with other people that are not a part of their family. So families are very essential to every human society. And then there are other sets and levels of human community. As we said, we have the family, and then we also have, you could say, local communities like small villages, that they have something in common that they don't have with other parts of a nation, for instance, that they have a very, you could say, common set of traditions and practices that they have had over a very long time, perhaps, that they know the neighbors very well. So I also think we need to take into account that human beings form communities on different levels, the family and a very local community, and then perhaps we can begin to talk about larger communities. So, right.
Yes. Yes, that is a very good point too. That not only is it like natural that human beings live in groups, and just one quick mention on what you said, and I agree that this is an erroneous view of the liberal ideology that somehow each individual starts by himself and then they come together to form a society, because there is no place in nature where individual human beings live completely alone. So everybody always starts within a group, and maybe the group changes, or it changes shape, or some people die and other people are born, or there is a war and some people are killed. But there is always a group. There is never a situation where just individuals exist without being in a group. And then I think the next very important point that you mentioned is that human beings form communities on different levels. And so, for example, Aristotle also said that the family is like the closest, smallest, and tightest community basically that you have. And then a lot of families build a village, and maybe a lot of villages build like a district, and then a lot of districts build a nation, for example. And then even nations can have like treaties between each other, but we will start small. So this is a very important point as well. Another thing that went through my mind, which is also an essential human characteristic, is that human beings work. So human beings are not exactly like animals in the sense that they just run around following their instincts and live off of what they just find by accident in nature, but they have, at least for a long time now, for maybe 10,000 or 20,000 years since the agricultural revolution, they have really started to cultivate nature and to build tools and to build up their environment so that it can provide better for them. And we call this work. And this is also an absolutely universal fact about human beings. Wherever there are human beings, they work. They have to cultivate food, they have to make tools, they build houses, they maybe collect firewood, etc. So this, I think, is another important point.
Very true. And also the point about work, I think, also raises the basics of property rights in a very important sense. That because we human beings by nature work, we work to sustain ourselves, to create wealth, and to pass this wealth on to our children, or at least the next generations. We by nature form boundaries about who is going to have control over what kind of resources. So when a particular family cultivates this particular piece of land and creates an agricultural thing out of it, then that piece of land by necessity must be owned by that particular family. They must be left in peace to cultivate and to work on that land without oppression and suppression by other groups, or else that would interfere with their natural tendency to work and to cultivate and to produce. So in other words, for human beings to sustain themselves in a sustainable and productive manner, they need some space from other human beings to cultivate a particular piece of land or resources, to improve it, to generate wealth out of it, and to make individuals and also families become stable and self-sufficient and wealthy. So that people are left alone to a certain degree with their own resources to cultivate is very essential for every good and sustainable society. So here we can therefore say that human beings have a natural right to property, private property, in the sense that they need some resources to control on their own and be left alone.
Yes, that's very interesting, because now you introduced the notion of natural right, which has always been a very fascinating notion to me. And I think that it is really true in a very fundamental sense, that we do not just define rights or structures of interaction as we please, but it is more that we discover them, that we have to discover through human nature. We discover the natural laws or natural rights that function to organize a society, whereas a perversion of these natural principles will lead to a unstable and not lasting society. It will break apart because it is in conflict with the nature of the individuals that live in this society. And so I think we can now see, so far we have three important principles. So we said human beings form communities on different levels. Human beings, what was the second one? That they have a family and reproduce, yes. And they work, and through work comes the question of property rights. Who gets to decide what should happen with this piece of material, or with that piece of land, or with this tool, or whatever. And so maybe let's start from there and see what kind of natural laws come out of these three important categories. So if I can just start what I am thinking so far, in the district of organizing communities on different levels, I remembered the subsidiarity principle, so that local communities should be left alone to decide local principles. As far as this is possible now, this is not a precise definition, but I think it is still important that if, for example, the nation tries to control every little detail of every local community, then it is not an order that is conducive to human living, to the way we can flourish and live. And of course, sexuality and having a family is also something that there are some very widespread norms in the most human societies. There are similar norms about sexuality, for example, monogamy, and that, for example, the parents should take care of their children and not just abandon them. And also in the district of property rights, there is a certain conflict between each individual has to have the ability to have property for himself that he can use to sustain his life. But at the same time, there are also needs of the community as a whole, or there are I forgot the right word, but there are, yes, needs or necessities that have to be taken care of, and they can only be taken care of collectively. And also, the one big problem with property rights is if it comes together in a very small minority of people owning almost all the property, then this is also a thing that destabilizes a society. So there is also some important laws that we have to find out in this domain. Yes.
Yes, very, very good point. And since we mentioned property rights and that this is natural to man, some libertarians might say, oh, but wouldn't you then conclude that people must have absolute private property over all resources and that we don't need anything more than that? Doesn't that simply prove anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism? But as you say, there are boundaries and the conditions that need to be taken into account. And here we come into the distinction between private goods and common goods. Private goods are scarce, concrete resources that can be, and by nature is, owned by a very small group of individuals, either one particular individual or a small association or a family. For instance, a particular piece of land that they can cultivate on their own, and that's natural to them and important to them to sustain and generate wealth. But in a community, there are also goods that are common to all the members of that community. In other words, goods that are by nature shared between them and cannot be divided up into many small units that they can buy and sell on the market. Because with private goods or private property, we could further say that those things can be bought and sold on the market, because some people desire to have others' property in exchange for something they value less. So of course there is a room for markets to operate as well. If for instance families want to exchange resources so that they can have more of what they need. So markets and trade is also natural to man, but there are certain common goods that are essentially common to all, and they could, for instance, be, let's say, have a small local village, and this village commonly or collectively uses a river for their nourishment, that they, for instance, use it for fishing, and that fishing is very crucial to getting food for all the people in the local community. You could say that this river is a common good because it's used by all. It's not one individual who sort of homesteaded the river and excluded everyone else. It's something that all the inhabitants have used, you could say, perhaps for a very long time, collectively. So you cannot reduce the river to some privately owned good. It's something that is common to all, and therefore any decision then that's going to be made about that river must concern the welfare and well-being of the entire community as a whole. Or more abstract common goods, like you could say borders for migrants from the external world to come into that community. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, that concerns the community, because you could say migration affects the community as a whole. All other things could be culture, cultural norms. If a essential piece of that community completely changes its moral norms or cultures, that might affect the whole community. So there are many goods that concern the whole of community, and they can't be owned or controlled by one single individual or association. They must be decided upon in a fellowship of the entire community. And therefore there needs to be some, I would say, social or public entity to decide what is going to happen with these common goods on behalf of the whole community.
Yes. And of course, one interesting question is then, how should this be organized? Like, should everybody have an equal say at what happens with these goods? Or do you, for example, want to count the voice of wise or very brave or industrious people more than the voice of others? So this is also an interesting topic, but I wouldn't want to go into the details too much right now. But so we have now seen one important point on the property rights, which is there needs to be a balance between individual property rights and also goods that are somehow affect the whole community and cannot be split up into small units that each control for themselves without affecting the others. So we have kind of the private public good distinction, but then also we have another important point, which is that somehow the thing is, in every industry or in every society, there are certain people that are more successful than others. And this can be because they are lucky, or it can, most often it is because they have certain characteristics or talents that are especially well adapted to this society that they live in. So for example, in the Stone Age, if you had a very good health and very good eyesight and very good physical condition, then this was presumably a large advantage, and you would be more successful in society than, for example, someone who is weak and always sick and has bad eyesight. And then these individuals that are more successful, they tend to aggregate the property. And there is this very difficult principle. It is called the Pareto principle, or also some economists call it the Matthew principle. From the Bible, there is this saying, to those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And it refers exactly to this point, that if you have more than another and you know how to invest it wisely, then you get even more, and then you get even more with this. And so the curve kind of grows exponentially. And that means that at some point there will be more and more people stacking up at the bottom of society that have almost nothing and can have almost no possibility of getting ahead, because most of the property is already owned by some other individual and he keeps increasing it. So I think this is an important problem, and I'm not entirely sure how it should be addressed, but I think every society needs some way of addressing it. because else when the difference becomes too big, then the society becomes unstable, because the people at the bottom are hungry and they get angry and they say, let's just kill this rich bastard and distribute everything again equally. And so this is also a problem that needs to be addressed in some way. Yes,
exactly. It's a very, very complicated and an interesting question, which is sort of a dilemma, because, as you say, there might be people who accumulate wealth and power far more than others because they have some talent, or it could be of luck, but usually it's because there's something about a particular individual which makes them able to accumulate more and more and more power or wealth than many others, and thus they can concentrate a lot of important resources or power in their own hands at the expense of others, and that might create huge social tensions, for instance, or poverty, or something like that. And that's a very, very important problem, and I don't have a particular answer to that yet. I suppose that society perhaps must be organized in some way to secure that people's place and position in society is within boundaries, you could say. That, of course, I would say that there are inequalities between human beings, and some people will be in better positions than others, and that's simply human nature, and we have to accept that. But there needs to be some boundaries so that someone can simply go extremely big and powerful, like some would say the robber barons have done in the 19th century. So perhaps we could say that the flexibility of accumulating power must be restrained in some sense, that there will be the possibility of increasing or decreasing power and wealth, but it must be within limits and boundaries. It must be, as you said, balanced with the well-being of the entire community. So here we might speculate that we need to replace the modern economic system with something else which prevents such dangers from occurring. But of course, that's a very complicated matter as well. What kind of economic system would we then construct to prevent this and still have many of the good aspects that human beings desire and need? Such as, for instance, we mentioned the private property being natural and good to human beings, so they need to have some space and freedom with regards to that. But how we're going to reconcile that with a society in which everyone has a certain position which doesn't get too far or too extreme, we have to make some balance there, and that might be difficult. Right.
Yes, and I think let's leave it at that for the moment. This is one of the critical issues that a constitution, or like the organization of society, has to consider. And I would also like to come to a second thing, which is the fact that human beings reproduce and have families. And there are also, I already mentioned it briefly, there are also very widely spread norms that keep sexuality in bounds. And this is, for me, this was like the cure from anarcho-capitalism. When I realized that monogamy is absolutely essential to a civilized society, but it has nothing to do with the anarcho-capitalist notion of pure private property. But it is a different principle, but it is also essential, and it is for exactly the same reason, because we said power and wealth tends to accumulate in the hands of the very capable and successful. And when this happens, of course, also their social status increases. And if they are males, then their attractiveness increases. And at the same time, they are also capable of, for example, having 10 wives and 25 kids and feeding all of them because they are so economically successful. But this then again creates a situation where more and more men are not able to find a wife at all because they are all taken by this one or by these 20% of very successful guys, because the Pareto distribution says 20% of people get 80% of the property, like if you just let it run. And so this means 20% of the men get 80% of the women, and a lot of men will have no wife at all. And this is just, this is what you see in nature, where basically in most species that don't have a very strong natural predator, the males always fight for access to the group of females. You can see this in bison, in lion, in kangaroos, in just about every species that you can think of. And this will happen in human society too, if you don't have monogamy, for example, to stop this trend. Yes, so that's one point.
That's a very interesting point about monogamy. I haven't thought of it that way before, but it's very true when you say it. And also I think that sexuality and marriage and families, we need to understand it in its human nature. You could say that. I would say sexuality has to be understood in the context of reproduction and forming families. So therefore, you could say very modern liberal or libertine or libertarian view of sexual morality has gotten to the very extreme that sexuality is just a means of pleasure, and reducing it to that, and sort of separating sexuality from the traditional context of establishing families and reproducing and begetting children, and doing that with a spouse for a man, or for a husband in the case of a wife, and that has some problems, as you say. The human beings or human beings in community, they need to have some particular traditions and customs when it comes to sexuality and how families are formed, to avoid complete moral disaster, or that some people would completely exploit the situation. And also, I think we could appeal to a principle that Friedrich Hayek mentioned, that traditional norms, for instance, with regards to sexuality, that is something that has developed in the most successful cultures in the world, especially in the West. So we could say that there has been sort of a cultural evolution where the best norms and best values have survived, and that the best cultures have adapted those set of customs and traditions with regards to, for instance, sexuality. And therefore we should say that there is some value to these customs and traditions, since they have lasted for so long and has been so successful with regards to the community, being so successful in competition with other cultures and other communities as well.
Yes, and I think here it is also important to mention, at least that's the way I see it, that again, there has to be a balance, like, because sexuality is also a thing that is pleasurable in life. And this is an important aspect of human nature as well. And if you completely crush the freedom and the pleasure out of it, like in the Victorian age, then this leads to a lot of problems in society too. So it's again probably a thing where you have different poles, and you somehow have to find the gray area in between, where the problems of one extreme are reduced, but also the problems of the other extreme are reduced. So because I think it's difficult. For example, I wouldn't want to make the point here that if someone, for example, is homosexual, so they are not attracted to people of the other sex, then I think there has to be a way that they can exist in society too. There has to be some niche that they can inhabit that is good for them and at the same time not destructive for society as a whole. And the same goes for the pleasure generally in sexuality. It's not just like a means of making new people, but at the same time, if you just let it run completely wild, then I do think now, I didn't think this all the time, but I do think now that some serious problems can arise out of that.
Well, I would say that the whole issue, as with many other moral issues, need to be regulated by virtue, in a sense, that human beings need to find some balance within themselves to regulate their, you could say, desires and lusts, so that they can live in a sustainable manner, both internally and with other human beings. So in the case of sexuality, that would be regulated by the virtue of chastity, to avoid complete immodesty, you could say. Or when it comes to feelings, to avoid your feelings being completely running amok and going out of control, you need to have some sort of temperance or wisdom to regulate them, so that there is a perfect balance between reason and feelings, as Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and many other philosophers have argued. So that's another particular point, that human society needs to have virtue. People need to be raised in a sense that they are grown up with certain virtues that they need to embrace to control themselves and restrain their lusts and desires from going completely out of control. Or for instance, as we mentioned last time, the human tendency to commit evil, to be greedy and envious and selfish and hungering for power, etc., needs to be regulated by the virtue of charity and love and compassion, etc., etc. And in this sense, I would say that value systems, such as, for instance, Christianity, has done a very good job at promoting virtue, and in some sense, not of course completely without problems, but in a considerable degree has encouraged people to take care of their own moral problems and be regulated by virtue. So in other words, virtue is very essential to a good and productive society.
Yes, I completely agree, though I think maybe we should leave, or the problem is, if we talk about human nature and say it requires virtue, and then we try to define virtue by reference to human nature, then we will have a problem. So I think I do agree, and I think virtue is kind of the automation of habits that reflect these fundamental aspects of human nature, and, as you said, regulate them in a sustainable manner. So I think if we find out what human nature is, or what aspects it has, and what natural laws follow from this, then we can infer also from there what actually are the important virtues. So, for example, as you said, chastity, or not just having sex with whoever you want, whenever you want, wherever you want, is of course an important, it's completely essential in our society. Like, it's so normal that people don't even realize how normal it is. But this again is a critique on the anarcho-capitalist idea of property rights, because I can't just start masturbating in the street. This doesn't work. And I can't just have sex with my wife somewhere where other people watch, because it strongly affects other people to see direct display of sexual action. And so that's why these things have to be regulated. But also, I think an important point that I want to make is that regulation is not to say repression. So regulation means, as Aristotle says, you need to find the right balance between the two extremes. And so the one extreme is just follow your desire for pleasure whenever it strikes you. And the other extreme is not being able to experience any pleasure at all. And both of them are not stable in the long run. You cannot sustain this way of living. And the same also goes for feelings, which you mentioned, that if you just let your feelings control you whenever they come up, this does not work. But if you completely repress them and never and don't have any way to deal with them, or to process them, and also to allow them in certain situations and certain contexts where it is constructive, then at some point they will just break out violently, and there will also be problems. So yes, that was, I think, an important point for me.
Yes, exactly. And to bring about some examples, as you say, it's very important that we do not go to the other extreme and say that no pleasure or no joy is allowed at all, and that wouldn't work. And that also contradicts human nature, because we are human beings, and we, to a certain degree, desire, you could say, entertainment or joy in our lives. So that will also contradict human nature. And for instance, the extreme Puritans or Pietists in the United States of the 19th century, you could say it's an example of this extreme, where they wanted to ban alcohol completely and set very strict limits upon what you could do. Limits that are, you could say, too strict when it comes to sustainable and natural virtues. Or I would say society in the 1950s. Even though society in the 1950s had some good elements, you could say that morality was too shallow, or too incompassionate or cold, one would say, and therefore you had this huge rebellion of young people in the 1960s and the sexual revolution, etc., which was sort of a reaction to the 1950s. Now, of course, the sexual revolution was a complete disaster, but we could of course agree that society in the 1950s had some problems as well, which had to be addressed. So it's very important, as you say, to have this balance and to recognize that we cannot just go too far, for instance, with the alcohol thing, that alcohol is not in and of itself a bad thing. It can be pleasurable and a good thing, and can entertain many, as long as you keep it in balance, as long as you don't get completely drunk, etc. To make one example. So this balance, this golden mean between two extremes, as Aristotle put it, is important. Now, of course, a golden mean can't be the case in every situation. You can't have a golden mean between peace and war, or murder and non-murder. So some things are black and white, of course, but with other things like alcohol, we need to find a reasonable balance.
Yes, and I remembered the point that I was forgetting before, and it has to do with children. And so I think there are almost two separate topics that are like very fundamental to human nature that have to do with sexuality. And one is just sexuality itself and the pleasure and the monogamy and everything. But the other is, or no, I didn't mean monogamy, I mean the finding of a mate. And the other aspect is children, because when a child comes into this world, it is for a long time very dependent on someone taking care of it. And this is an absolutely fundamental aspect of human beings, that I think they are the animal with the longest time of dependence, where a child depends on its parents or on someone. And that's why there are also always customs about taking care of your children. And I think an important aspect that many people today have completely forgotten or not realized is marriage is not primarily a social institution for the parents, but it is a social institution for the children. Many people here in the West have forgotten or failed to realize that marriage is not primarily an institution that is designed for the pleasure or the well-being of the parents, but it is designed for the children, because there are a lot of psychological studies that it is by far the best situation for a child to grow up with his biological parents, both of them, in a family. And so I think this is a point that is almost a separate point from just having sex and finding a mate and all these topics.
Yes, good point. And also you could say that, as you mentioned, the thing about monogamy versus polygamy, and that's another thing, that if you have polygamy, that might be problematic for the children as well. There will be weird situations with having multiple mothers, and only one of those mothers are your own, and that might be very problematic with relation to your siblings in a family, etc. So there are also arguments that monogamy secures that the children will grow up in a very healthy and natural and understandable environment. So a family must take into account the best situation for the children. And we could say the well-being of the family is an analogy to the well-being of the community as a whole as well, that there needs to be stable conditions that favors everyone, also the vulnerable and weak. That's why you can have complete accumulation of power without any constraints whatsoever. And we need to take into account the well-being of the entire community, not only of each individual. So there needs to be private goods and common goods. So I suppose we are now getting at the end of our discussion, and perhaps you could just summarize what we have been through. I can begin and then you can take over. So we basically talked about how we should organize society based on human nature. And when we study human nature, we find out that human beings are social animals. We form community by nature. It's natural to us. We form communities on different levels. For instance, the family, because we have a tendency to reproduce and have children, and also we have communities in local villages, for instance, and we also form greater communities such as a network of villages or a nation. And also human beings desire property rights, because by nature they work and cultivate land and resources, and they need to be left alone to a certain degree to take care of that themselves and be sustainable. So private property is natural. But of course we can't just say that private goods is the only thing that matters, because there are common goods that need to be regulated by a common social entity that we may call government. So also government is natural to man to a certain degree.
Yes, exactly. And we also, in the domain of property rights, we also saw that it shouldn't happen that too few people can acquire too much of the whole resources within a society or acquire too much wealth, because else society will become unstable. And this is also a principle. We haven't found a precise solution how it can be solved, but it has to be addressed by a society, that people can both acquire individual wealth and improve their life, but at the same time there has to be some boundaries so that also something remains for other people to live and to improve their life. So that is also an important point. Then a quick side note to the forming of communities, we also said that the subsidiarity principle is somehow important, that the larger the larger organization cannot completely crush the freedom of the smaller local organization. And yes, then we talked about the having a family, and that there are basically two aspects, namely sexuality or reproduction, and also the raising of children. And we agreed that for both of these things, monogamy is an important an important social institution, and also that there needs to be a balance between, or yes, because this was another point that we mentioned, that human beings also need to have a certain amount of pleasure in their life, and that there, with everything that is pleasurable, there needs to be a balance between allowing pleasure to a certain degree, but not letting it run out of hand so that it starts to really destroy other important aspects of society. And we said this for sexuality and for alcohol, but the same thing could be said for other pleasurable things as well, like eating or whatever. And the last point was that human beings also have a tendency towards evil, and that I think a society needs to take this into account and to find ways to deal with this propensity towards evil, which is also in each human being. So these are, I think, the points that we found so far about fundamental to human nature and about how a society should therefore be organized.
Right, exactly. And I could also mention one thing which is worth mentioning about the limits of markets. We also discussed briefly that some goods, private goods, can be bought and exchanged between people in a community because you might have, they want each other resources more than their own, so there might be many gains to have from market exchanges, but not everything could be products of markets like common goods. They are other goods that are common to all. They cannot be divided up into many units. They need to be taken, they need to be accounted for by the whole community. So in other words, we could say that we oppose complete libertarianism, but we also oppose socialism and communism and totalitarianism, etc.
Yes.
So
yes, so okay, this was very interesting. I don't think it is conclusive that we have covered everything that has to be said about human nature, but maybe we can see, maybe we will continue this discussion the next time or some other time. Yes, let me know what you think. How should we continue from here?
right, yeah, so there are many directions this could go, I suppose. Perhaps more about virtues that are essential to society, how people should live. Try to apply these general principles to current systems, how we're going to, for instance, implement some changes today based on human nature. Perhaps talk more about examples of common goods versus private goods, and apply those principles to economics, or perhaps more philosophical aspects of the human nature, perhaps the relation between society and religion, or immigration, or war, or something like that. Because, as you say, we have now gotten through some general principles, and of course principles need to be applied in some sense. Perhaps we could take more wisdom from history or experience as well to understand society and human nature as well. So, okay, it seems like this is the end of our very interesting discussion, and as you said, we might continue this later. Is there anything else you want to say to the audience before we stop?
Yes, just one thing. If there is one particular direction this conversation could go that you would particularly enjoy, then please let us know in the comment section, and then we will maybe follow this path first. So other than that, yes, it was a very interesting and enjoyable conversation, and I'm looking forward to more of it. So
great. And of course, to the audience, you can find both of our YouTube channels. If you want to watch Amos Zweig, just search for its name and you'll find his work. And of course, you have my work at Creative Christoffer. So that's the end of it. Thank you very much, Amos, for coming on my channel to talk about these things. And have a great day.
yes, thank you very much. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.